So much for the historical background. But there still are some things you should know before deciding to use Linux. First, we must remember that Linux is not Windows. It's a completely different operating system. Depending on the application, it sometimes performs better and sometimes worse. But above all else, it works differently. The Linux system will often behave differently than Windows. It's also built differently. In general, it's developed according to a different concept. Windows was designed primarily to serve a single user at a time and operate stably and reliably. These are the basic assumptions, and for example in Windows, multiple users cannot work on a single computer at the same time. We can of course create additional users, but we'll have to switch between the users. We have to log out as one user to be able to log in as another. With Linux, the assumption is that the system should allow a very large number of users to work simultaneously, especially in the console mode, where we can have hundreds of different registered users performing different actions at the same time, and the system will work fine. In this system, we can even run multiple graphics modes at once, allowing multiple users to simultaneously work in graphical environment. This difference in approach entails certain consequences. The Windows user, as he or she is alone in the system at any given time, generally has complete control over it. Of course, insofar as the operating system allows. The Linux users have control only over what concerns them directly. The system provides a working location, but does not allow too much interference with itself. The fundamental mistake that many aspiring Linux users make is the conviction that they are working on a free alternative to Windows. Well, they're not. If someone starts using Linux with such an approach, unfortunately, they may be disappointed. This system works differently. You should be aware of that. Very often, users can get the impression that Linux is too different. We have already mentioned that the assumptions of this system are radically different and, unfortunately, sometimes the impression is true. Especially that with Linux family systems, there are many development choices for different types of solutions. And it often happens that people developing a particular system variant begin to introduce solutions that are somewhat strange or unexpected for an average user. From the developer's point of view, they bring a new quality, or revolutionary solutions. But they are not necessarily what an average user expects, as he or she is accustomed to certain behaviors. But fortunately, we have many choices here. So a user can change the system to resemble Windows. However, we still need to be aware that some things will look different. As we've already mentioned, the tools in Linux are mostly designed by and for their authors, and not the rest of the community. We must therefore be aware that we need to get familiar with each new application we use and have some custom keyboard shortcuts, because its creator figured that it would be more convenient for him to work like that. The problem with so-called user-friendly interface is that user-friendliness does not always mean what we think it does. Familiar is friendly, but familiar does not mean productive. Friendly does not mean effective. For example, the average user is familiar with cutting out pieces of text by pressing Ctrl+X, and it will be considered user-friendly. However, some Linux word editors don't have that keyboard shortcut, because it really requires too much work to cut out larger amounts of text. Some editors rely on abbreviations. For instance, D is cutting a single word, and D5 is cutting 5 words. Such shortcuts allow us to work a lot faster with your application, provided that we know them. You also have to be aware that the desktop environment is not an effective environment. It is very friendly as it generates some kind of hints. If we use the graphical environment both in Linux and Windows, in both cases, the environment will help us, but it will slow us down as well. It frees us from the need to remember a large number of keyboard shortcuts, or something like that. Some Linux solutions are efficiency-oriented, and therefore, unfortunately, friendliness can be disturbed in the view of a user accustomed to certain behaviors. It's important to remember that Linux users create a unique community. Let's start with the fact that this community exists. It's close-knit, not as much as closed, but simply its members actually work together. There are many organizations whose main objective is the development of the Linux system and tools available on it. Around each organization, or around any major tools that Linux system has, there is some community and it behaves like any other community in the world. Keep in mind that in such a community, no one expects anything from anyone, because no one is obliged to do anything. For example, when we buy Windows or Microsoft Office, when something doesn't work, we expect help from technical support, and we expect it quickly. With Linux solutions, which are usually made available on a look what I did, make good use of it, it may be useful to you basis. If something does not work, we're expected to solve the problem ourselves. Of course, in some cases, technical support is available. Web browsers or distributions that are created for users have such support. But in many cases, the user must take matters into his own hands and somehow ensure that the system works the way he wants. In fact, it's expected that when submitting an application error, you immediately come up with a fix. Code is available, so you can write it. Community also understands that not everyone is a computer science graduate, so if someone describes a problem properly, it's considered sufficient. You just have to be aware that you won't always get help that you'd like, or not as fast as you would like. I don't want that to scare you. It's not that bad. Distributions forums or tutorials are very extensive, and a new user can always cope with their help. You should have an awareness of how the community works, though. Linux is built on a certain philosophy, the philosophy of open software, and not on the philosophy of delivering a product that would dominate the market. Linux dominance in the market means that its main creators don't really gain anything, besides a certain reputation in the market, which does not translate into any financial or material benefit for them. A lot of projects are being carried out on a voluntary basis, or as a pastime. An interesting feature that may not necessarily be well understood is that this freedom applies to software, not users. Most often, software freedom goes along with more freedom for the user. Usually, we have some alternatives available. If we don't like something about one program, we can easily switch to an alternative solution. For example, you can switch from one email client to another, and the data stored in one program can be opened in the other. It's very common that migration poses no difficulty. However, sometimes if you'd like to use some functionality commercially, it may be impossible, because the licenses will not allow it. Licenses are designed to protect the code from being taken over by commercial companies, not to protect the users.